Welcome to Law Enforcement Encounters, Learning the Badge. Tonight's episode is called The Talk. There are certain conversations parents have with their children that stay with them for the rest of their lives. For me, one of those conversations happened when I was a young boy growing up in Vallejo, California. My mother and father talked to me and my siblings about what we should do if we were ever stopped by the police. They didn't have to make the conversation complicated. Their message was actually very simple. When you're stopped by the police, and you will be, listen to what they are telling you. Do what they ask you to do. Don't give them a reason to believe that you are a threat when you are not. And then came the part that stayed with me. You can be right and dead at the same time. And what good will being right do for you then? Your family will still be heartbroken. That was my parents' version of the talk. But there's something important I want to add to this episode. I'm not teaching you something that I only learned after becoming a police officer. I lived this first. I was the young black kid being stopped by the police before I ever became the police officer making the stop. And when I look back at the vehicle stops I experienced as a young man, I can actually see myself learning the lesson my parents had been trying to teach me. I chose to listen. I was young when I received that message, but I understood that my parents were telling me something important. I could have rejected it. I could have become angry about it. I could have interpreted their message as telling me that I had no rights or that police officers were always right. But that wasn't what they were trying to tell me. They were teaching me something about my own behavior. They were telling me, control what you can control. I cannot always control what another person thinks. I cannot control an officer's attitude. I cannot control whether an officer is having a bad day. I can't control the officer if the officer misunderstands something that I do or something that I said. And I certainly cannot control every decision another human being makes. But I can control me. I can't control my hands. I can't control my movements. I can't control my voice, whether I listen, whether I argue, whether I suddenly reach for something. And most importantly, I can control whether I make a difficult decision even more difficult. That lesson became a part of me. But before it became part of me, I had to learn it the hard way. My first vehicle stop, 17 years old. I was 17 years old, driving my parents' car in South Vallejo. I was on my way to pick up a friend. I wasn't thinking about the police. I wasn't thinking about my parents' warnings. I was 17 years old, driving like a lot of 17-year-olds drive, just moving through the world and not paying much attention to what was going on around me. Then I looked into my rearview mirror. Red lights. In California, we use red lights to pull over vehicles. In other parts of the United States, they use blue. On this particular day, red lights. That was it. My first real vehicle stop. My heart pounding, and almost immediately, I could hear my mother and father's voices in my head. Of course, I knew what to do. When you get stopped by the police, do what they ask you to do. They have a job to do. Don't let them misinterpret your actions. I had been taught. I knew better. And then I proceeded to do almost exactly the opposite. The officer approached and asked for my driver's license and registration. Instead of simply providing them, I hit him with an attitude. What did you stop me for? The officer asked again, this time with a little more emphasis. I need to see your driver's license and your registration. And there I was, 17 years old, testing the waters, testing the officer, and quite frankly, testing the very lesson my parents had given me. I was rude. It was almost like I didn't even know what came over me. I don't know why I was in this state of mind. The officer would say something, and I wasn't really listening. I had a messed up attitude. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, I should have been asking myself, what happened to everything Mom and Dad taught you? The officer took my license and returned to his patrol car. Now I had nothing to do but sit there. 8 or 10 minutes later, he returned. He had a ticket, speeding. 39 miles per hour in a 35 mile per hour zone. 4 miles an hour over. He handed me the citation and told me to sign it. By then, I had been brought back down to earth, back to reality, because I knew better. That was the part that bothered me. I knew better. My parents had prepared me for this exact moment. And when the moment arrived, I decided I was going to test their warning, and I failed. The officer gave me my copy, told me to have a good day, and sent me on my way. I remember thinking afterward that I wanted a do-over. Can we start this thing again? Can we go back to the beginning? Of course we couldn't. And that became another lesson. You only get one chance to make a first impression. My first law enforcement encounter was, in my words, an epic fail. But maybe I needed that failure, because approximately 1 year later, I got another opportunity. Stop number 2, Richmond, California. About a year later, I was attending Contra Costa College and playing college football. After practicing one day, I drove home one of my teammates to North Richmond. This was an area I didn't know particularly well, and when I pulled up near his house, I immediately became uncomfortable. There were a number of young men outside. Several approached my vehicle. One moved his shirt enough that I could see the butt of a handgun in his waistband. My teammate quickly let them know who I was and that I was with him. The situation settled down, but I was ready to leave. I headed back towards familiar territory, Vallejo. And just before I entered the freeway, I looked in my rearview mirror. There they were again, red lights, the police, the Richmond Police Department. Second vehicle stop in about a year, but this time, something was different. Me. I remembered Vallejo. I remembered that ticket. I remembered my attitude, and most importantly, I remembered my parents. So when I pulled over, I decided I wasn't going to repeat that first encounter. The officer got out of his patrol car and approached me. He was wearing those dark sunglasses that were common among officers back then, and I couldn't see his eyes. But I knew something. He could see me. He could see my hands. He could see my movements, and I wanted him to know from the moment he approached that I was not a threat. So I put my hands on the steering wheel. Nobody had taught me that specific technique. I just did it. I wanted my hands where he could see them. The officer asked for my driver's license and my registration. This time, okay. I gave him what he requested. And then I asked him, "How are you doing today?" Think about the difference. Same young man, another police officer, another traffic stop, but an entirely different approach. The officer smiled. He told me he was doing well and said he'd be back after checking my information. I waited, hands visible. No attitude, no argument, no attempt to prove anything. And the entire energy of the encounter felt different. When the officer returned, he started talking to me. Where was I coming from? I told him I had dropped off one of my teammates. He asked if I was in high school. I told him no. We played college football at Contra Costa Community College. Then he asked me something I never expected. "What's your major?" I answered criminal justice. He said, "Good." And then he handed me my driver's license. He told me he had stopped me because I was driving a little fast after dropping off my friend, nothing major. He wanted to warn me about driving safely. Then he told me, "Have a good season, son, and good luck with your career." I remember answering, "Thank you, sir. Be safe." And that was it. No citation, no confrontation, just a warning. The lesson I didn't understand yet. That encounter stayed with me. At that time, I was looking at it strictly from the citizen's perspective. I had treated the officer respectfully. He had treated me respectfully. The encounter ended without a citation, but years later, after I became a police officer myself, I realized there was another lesson hidden inside that stop. Just because you stop somebody doesn't mean you have to give them a ticket. Sometimes a warning is enough. Think about that. A police officer in Richmond unknowingly taught a future Sacramento police officer something about discretion. Years later, I would make hundreds of vehicle stops myself. And there were plenty of times when I encountered a respectful driver, explained why I stopped them, gave them a stern warning, and sent them on their way. Where did some of that come from? Maybe from Richmond, maybe from that officer, maybe from sitting behind that steering wheel as a young black college student and experiencing what professional discretion felt like from the other side. Long before I wore a badge, encounters with police officers were already teaching me how I wanted to wear it. 4 years, 4 vehicle stops. Richmond wasn't the last time. I was stopped in East Oakland and I was stopped in Eureka, California. For 4 consecutive years in my youth, I experienced a vehicle stop. 3 of those stops occurred in inner city environments. And something interesting happened. I received 1 citation. The first one, the Vallejo stop, the stop where I had the worst attitude. After that first encounter, I changed how I handled myself. In Richmond, Oakland, and Eureka, I treated the officers respectfully. And in my personal experience, they treated me respectfully in return. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not telling you that being respectful guarantees an officer will treat you properly. It doesn't. I'm not telling you that if an encounter goes badly, it must be because the citizen did something wrong. That's not true either. And I'm certainly not telling you that police misconduct disappears simply because you're polite. What I am telling you is what my parents taught me. Control the part of the encounter that belongs to you. My behavior belonged to me. My attitude belonged to me. My hands belong to me, movements belong to me, words belong to me, and those 4 vehicle stops began teaching me something I would understand much more deeply after I became a police officer. The talk was about survival, not surrender. This is an important distinction. My parents were not teaching me that every police officer was right. They were not telling me to give up my constitutional rights. They were not telling me that I had to agree with everything an officer said or did. They were teaching me that the side of the road is not the courtroom. There is a difference between cooperating with an officer during an encounter and agreeing that everything about that encounter is correct. You can cooperate and still disagree. You can remain calm and still believe that you were treated unfairly. You can follow unlawful instructions and later question the officer's actions. You can remember the officer's name, badge number, patrol car number, location, time, witness, and what happened. And afterward, if you believe something improper occurred, there are ways to address it. But first, get through the encounter safely. That is what my parents wanted for me. They wanted their son to come home. This statement deserves some explanation because I don't want young people to misunderstand it. What does "don't look like a threat" mean? It does not mean changing who you are. It does not mean that your race, clothing, neighborhood, hairstyle, music, or personality make you a threat. I'm talking about behavior during the encounter. If an officer tells you to keep your hands where they can see them, keep them visible. I think back to the Richmond stop. Nobody told me to put my hands on the steering wheel. I did it because I understand instinctively that the officer approaching my car didn't know me. I knew who I was. He didn't. If your driver's license is in your pocket, don't suddenly reach into that pocket without communicating what you are doing. Say, my driver's license is in my front right pocket. Is it okay if I reach for it? If your registration is inside the glove compartment, communicate that before reaching. If you don't understand an instruction, ask for clarification. If you believe that you are free to leave, you can calmly ask, "Officer, am I being detained? Or am I free to go?" If you are being detained, don't run. Don't turn a detention into a foot pursuit. Don't turn a traffic stop into a vehicle pursuit. Don't turn an argument into a physical confrontation. The goal is not to win the encounter. The goal is to get through it safely. Now I understand the other side. There is another reason this message means so much to me today. When my parents first gave me the talk, I received it as a young black boy growing up in Vallejo. I didn't know that years later I would become a police officer myself. I didn't know that I would eventually spend decades in law enforcement. And I certainly didn't know that one day I would stand in front of young people teaching them about police encounters. That journey allowed me to experience both sides of this conversation. I know what it feels like to see those red lights suddenly appear in your rearview mirror. I know what it feels like to have your heart start pounding. I know what it feels like to wonder, why is this officer stopping me? And I know what it feels like to have an officer walking towards your car while you're sitting behind the steering wheel. But then my life changed. Eventually, I became the officer walking toward the car. And that changed my understanding of everything. The officer doesn't know everything about you. They don't know what kind of person you are. They don't know what happened during the rest of your day. They don't know whether you're frightened, angry, nervous, embarrassed, or simply reaching for your wallet. They are trying to read your behavior while simultaneously thinking about their own safety. That is why communication matters. Talk to the officer. This is where I want young people to move beyond simply hearing. Don't run from the police. That's important. But now let's go further. What happens when you actually have to talk to the police? You may be nervous. That's okay. You may not like police officers. You may have had a bad experience before. You may believe this particular officer has no legitimate reason to be talking to you. But none of those feelings prevent you from communicating professionally. If an officer says, "Can I talk to you for a second?" Listen carefully. Understand what kind of encounter you're having. If you don't know whether you have to stay, ask, "Am I being detained?" If the answer is no, you can ask, "Am I free to leave, officer?" If the answer is yes, leave calmly. If the officer tells you that you are being detained, listen to the instructions being given to you. You don't have to tell your entire life story. You don't have to volunteer information simply because you are nervous. You don't have to consent to a search merely because an officer asked for permission. You can respectfully say, "I'm sorry, officer, but I don't consent to searches." But understand something very important. Verbally asserting your rights is different from physically resisting an officer. Know the difference. Respect doesn't require agreement. One of the lessons I want young people to understand is that you can speak respectfully to someone that you disagree with. That applies to police officers, that applies to teachers, parents, coaches, supervisors, and eventually employers. Being respectful doesn't mean that you're right and I'm wrong. Sometimes respect simply means I'm going to control myself while we work through this. That is maturity. That is discipline. And during the police encounter, that discipline can become extremely important. What if the officer is wrong? There is another side of the talk that we have to discuss. Because I don't want anybody listening to me to walk away believing that I'm saying, just do whatever the police tell you to because the police are always right. Absolutely not. That's not what my parents taught me, and that's not what I'm teaching you. Because what happens when the police officer who stops you is rude as all get up? What happens when the officer approaches your car with an attitude? What happens when you're speaking respectfully but the officer isn't giving you the same respect? What happens when you believe the officer has already made up their mind about you? Now we're getting into the difficult part of the talk. Your feelings may be completely understandable. Imagine being a young man standing on the sidewalk. An officer stops you. You don't believe you've done anything wrong. The officer's tone is disrespectful. You answer a question and the officer tells you, "Shut up, I didn't ask you all that." Now you're angry. Maybe you're embarrassed because your friends were watching. Maybe people are recording. Maybe you're thinking, who does this officer think he's talking to? Those feelings are real. And this is where the lesson my parents taught me becomes more difficult to follow. Because it's easy to control yourself when somebody is treating you well. Can you control yourself when somebody isn't? That's the test. And I know something about failing that test. I was 17. I had been raised better. I knew that. I knew exactly what my parents had told me. But I allowed my emotions and attitude to take over anyway. That first Vallejo stop taught me that knowing the lesson and living the lesson are two entirely different things. The officer's perception matters, even when it's wrong. Here's something I've learned from spending years on both sides of this conversation. During a police encounter, perception can become incredibly important. The officer is watching your hands. They're watching your movements. They're listening to your voice. They're watching whether you're complying with instructions or not. The officer's perception matters, even when wrong. There's something I've learned from spending years on both sides of this conversation. During a police encounter, perception can become incredibly important. The officer is watching your hands. They're watching your movements. They're listening to your voice. They're watching whether you're complying with instructions. They're looking at who is around you. They're trying to determine whether you might flee or fight, reach for a weapon, or do something completely unexpected. And sometimes an officer can interpret something incorrectly. That's the part we cannot be afraid to discuss. A movement that you know is harmless may not look harmless to the officer. You know that you're reaching for your phone. The officer may believe that you're reaching for something else. You know you're turning around because somebody called your name. The officer may interpret the movement differently. You know your intentions and the officer doesn't. And when those perceptions collide, particularly during a tense encounter, the consequences can become serious and very quickly. And police officers must be held accountable. But I want to be equally clear about something else. The responsibility for a safe encounter does not belong entirely to the citizen. Police officers are professionals. They are trained. They are given tremendous authority. They carry weapons. They can detain people. They can arrest people. They can use force under circumstances permitted by law. With that authority comes an enormous responsibility. An officer doesn't get a free pass to unnecessarily disrespect somebody because they're wearing a badge. An officer doesn't get a free pass to escalate an encounter unnecessarily. And an officer certainly doesn't get a free pass for unlawful conduct. I hold police officers accountable too. I spent 28 years in law enforcement. I understand what the job requires. And because I understand it, I also understand what the public should expect from the people entrusted to perform it. Professionalism matters. Be a professional out here. That is what you do. You are a police officer. You've been trained to do this job. Do it and learn how to work with the community. Communication matters. Know how to communicate. Judgment matters. So does patience. De-escalation, that matters. Accountability matters. And I can tell you something else from experience. I made hundreds of vehicle stops as a police officer. I remember what it felt like to be 17. I remember Richmond. I remember Oakland and Eureka. I remember what it felt like when an officer gave me a warning instead of automatically writing me a citation. Those experiences mattered. They followed me onto the other side of the badge. So why did our parents give us the talk? This is where we have to confront some uncomfortable history. Why did generations of black parents feel the need to have these conversations with their children, particularly their sons? Because the fear wasn't invented. There was a historical reality behind it, and black men have been killed during encounters with law enforcement. There have been justified uses of deadly force. There have also been controversial shootings, tragic mistakes, bad decisions, misconduct, and cases where officers were held criminally or administratively responsible. We shouldn't lump every police encounter together, but we shouldn't erase the history either. A misunderstanding between you and a police officer can have consequences far greater than the argument that started it. That's why they talked to me. That's why they told me about it. What happens if I test their warning? Now let's turn the question around. What if I had ignored my parents? Actually, I don't have to imagine it completely. At 17, I tested their warning. Nothing catastrophic happened. I received the speeding ticket. I went home. But the experience gave me a glimpse of something. What if every time an officer stopped me, my attitude became, I'm going to show this officer that he can't tell me what to do? Where could that decision eventually take me? An argument? A detention that lasts longer? A physical confrontation? An argument? A resisting charge? Someone getting injured? A weapon being introduced into the situation? Or, in the most extreme circumstances, someone losing their life? That doesn't automatically mean the citizen caused everything that followed. And it certainly doesn't mean every use of force by an officer is justified. Accountability still matters. But my parents were teaching me to reduce the number of things I could contribute to an already unpredictable situation. That's a major difference, right and dead. Now we can return to those words my parents gave me. You can be right and dead. That's a hard statement. Some people may not like it. I understand why. Because someone might hear those words and ask, why should I have to control myself if the officer is the one acting wrong? That's a legitimate question. It straight up is. My answer is because I'm trying to get you home. We can deal with the officer afterwards. File a complaint. Speak to a supervisor. Preserve the video or the audio. Whatever they get from the police department, preserve that from the body cams. Document what happened. Contact an attorney when appropriate. Challenge the citation. Challenge the arrest. Whatever's happening, that's not right. Test the officer's actions in court and hold the department accountable. There are mechanisms for doing those things, but none of those mechanisms work particularly well for you if a confrontation on the street turns into a tragedy. Two things can be true. This may be the most important lesson in this entire episode. Two things can be true at the same time. A citizen has a responsibility to control their behavior during a police encounter, and a police officer has a responsibility to control theirs. A citizen should not unnecessarily escalate an encounter, and neither should an officer. The citizen should understand that an officer may perceive certain movements as threatening, and the officer must make reasonable decisions based on the circumstances rather than simply acting on fear. I can teach young people how to survive and successfully navigate police encounters while also demanding professionalism and accountability from law enforcement. Those ideas do not contradict one another. That is what I want you to understand about the talk. My parents weren't giving me a political message. They were giving their son a survival message. Control what you can control. And after spending a career in law enforcement, I'm adding something to what my parents taught me. The person wearing the badge must control what they can control too. What my parents really gave me. Looking back, I realized my parents weren't simply giving me instructions about police officers. They were giving me a life lesson. They were teaching me self-control. They were teaching me to think beyond the emotion of the moment. They were teaching me that sometimes you have to ask yourself, what decision gives me the best chance of walking away from this situation safely? That message became deeply embedded in me. Eventually, I passed it down to my own children. I continually pass it down to young people who I coached and I've mentored. I pass it to my students in school, and now I continue passing it forward through law enforcement encounters, learning the badge. But there's something more personal about it now. When I teach this lesson, I'm not simply remembering what my parents told me. I'm remembering 4 young men behind 4 steering wheels, except all 4 of them were me. In Vallejo, in Richmond, in Oakland, and in Eureka. 4 years, 4 vehicle stops, 1 citation, and eventually hundreds of vehicle stops from the other side of the window. That's quite a journey when I think about it. Now I'm passing the talk on to you. So here's my version of the message my parents gave me so many years ago. If you encounter the police, don't run. Listen before reacting. Keep your hands visible. Avoid sudden movements. Communicate before reaching for something. Stay calm enough to understand what the officer is telling you. Know whether the encounter is consensual or whether you are being detained. Ask questions respectfully when you don't understand. Know your rights. Don't consent to a search simply because you feel pressured to say yes. Don't physically resist. Don't turn disagreement into conversation. And understand that you can challenge something later without trying to settle everything on the street. Most importantly, control what you can control. And the one thing you should always work to control is yourself. My parents gave me that message when I was a young boy growing up in Vallejo. At 17, I tested it. A year later in Richmond, I started understanding it. The stops in Oakland and Eureka reinforced it. Then I became a police officer and saw the encounter from an entirely different seat. I went from watching the red lights in my rearview mirror to being the person operating those red lights. I went from watching an officer walk toward my window to walking towards someone else's. And after experiencing police encounters from both sides of the badge, I understand my parents' message more deeply than I ever could have understood it as a child. They weren't telling me to fear the police. They weren't telling me that police officers were always right. They were preparing me. They were telling me, listen, think, communicate, control yourself, know your rights, and make decisions that give you the best opportunity to go home safely. I carried it through 4 vehicle stops as a young man. I carried it through a career in law enforcement. I carried it into the classroom. And now, through law enforcement encounters, learning the badge, I'm passing it on to you. This is Sam Davis, and you have been watching Law Enforcement Encounters. Thank you very much for paying attention to our cause. Peace.